The desert wind carried the smell of cordite and copper as the SEAL medics knelt beside her in the dust, their gloved hands pressed hard against a wound that should have already killed her. She had been pulled from the wreckage of a burned-out convoy 2 clicks south of a village that wasn't supposed to exist on any map, her face streaked with soot, her civilian clothes shredded, her dog tags missing. They had been told to expect a humanitarian translator, a local aid worker caught in the crossfire, nothing more. But when the lead medic cut away the torn fabric of her jacket to reach the bleeding, his hands stopped moving. The other medic looked over his shoulder, and for a long second neither of them breathed. Beneath the civilian disguise, pressed against her ribs by a hidden chest rig, was a laminated identification card neither of them had clearance to be looking at, and a tattoo on her collarbone that belonged to a unit they had been told for years did not officially exist. She opened her eyes, locked them onto the lead medic, and through cracked lips, she whispered for words that froze every man in that circle. "I outrank you. Listen, if you've ever wondered how far a woman will go to keep her country's secrets, stay until the end, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that medic's place?" Her name, the one her mother gave her, was Elena Marie Vance. Born in a small mill town in eastern Pennsylvania where the river ran rust-colored, and the men came home from the steel plant with their hands cracked and their eyes tired. Her father had served 2 tours in the Marine Corps before the mill swallowed him. And on Sunday afternoons he would sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and tell her stories about places she could not yet find on a map. Places with names that sounded like prayers and warnings at the same time. Her mother, a school nurse who had grown up watching her own brothers ship out and not all of them come back, did not love those stories, but she did not silence them either, because she understood that some children are born already listening for a sound the rest of the world cannot hear. Elena was that kind of child. By the time she was 12, she could field strip the old hunting rifle her father kept in the hall closet. By 14, she was running 5 miles before sunrise in boots 2 sizes too big. And by 16, she had memorized every branch of service, every rank insignia, every motto, the way other girls memorize song lyrics. Her high school guidance counselor told her to consider nursing, told her the military was a hard life for a young woman with her grades, told her she could be anything she wanted. And Elena smiled politely and wrote down every word, because she had already learned that the people who tell you what you cannot do are rarely the people who have done anything difficult themselves. The summer after graduation, she drove herself to the recruiter's office in a borrowed pickup truck, signed her name on a line that committed the next 8 years of her life to the United States Army. And when she came home, that evening her father did not speak for a long time. He simply walked out to the porch, stood with his back to her, and lit a cigarette he was not supposed to be smoking. When he finally turned around, there were tears in his eyes, and he said only one sentence. A sentence she would carry with her through every cold night and every bleeding hour for the next 15 years. He said, "Be the kind of soldier who comes home, but never the kind who comes home easy." Basic training broke her down the way it was designed to. And then it built her back up into something her mother almost did not recognize at the graduation ceremony at Fort Jackson. She had lost 12 pounds, gained a quiet steadiness in her shoulders, and developed the habit of standing perfectly still when she was thinking. A habit her drill sergeants had beaten into her 1 push-up at a time. She qualified expert on the rifle range during her 2nd week, scored in the top 3 of her company on the land navigation course, and earned a reputation among the other recruits as the soldier who would stay an extra hour in the bay to help anyone struggling with their gear. Even the ones who had laughed at her during the 1st week for being a girl from a mill town who thought she could keep up. She did not just keep up. She set the pace. After basic, she was funneled into military intelligence, then into a language program where she learned Pashto and a working dialect of Arabic faster than her instructors had seen in a decade. And from there, she was quietly pulled aside by a major she had never met, a man with gray at his temples and a folder under his arm, who asked her if she had ever considered work that would not appear on any official record. She thought about her father on the porch, about the cigarette and the tears, about the sentence he had given her like a piece of armor. And she said yes before the major had finished explaining what he was offering. The training that followed was unlike anything she had imagined. She learned to move through a crowd without leaving a memory behind, to speak 3 languages with the unconscious rhythm of a native, to read a room in the time it took most people to find a chair, and to fire a weapon with either hand from any position her body could be forced into. She learned that pain was information, that fear was a tool, and that the loneliest place in the world was the inside of a cover identity you had worn for so long you could no longer remember which laugh was yours and which one belonged to the woman you had invented. She learned, too, that she was good at it, frighteningly good, and that being good at it would cost her things she had not yet learned to name. By the time she was 24, she had already been in 3 countries her family would never know about, had already lost 2 friends whose real names she had never been allowed to speak aloud, and had already begun to understand what her father had meant when he warned her about coming home easy. She did not come home easy. She came home careful, and she came home quiet. And she came home with the kind of eyes that made her mother set down the dish towel and pull her into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected. The mission that brought her to that dust-covered road, kneeling in the grip of 2 SEAL medics who did not know who she was, had begun 9 months earlier in a windowless room in Northern Virginia. She had been briefed by a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Margaret, and who slid across the table a single photograph of a man whose name had been linked to the smuggling of weapons through a corridor that ran from a port city on the Persian Gulf up through 3 borders and into the hands of fighters who had been killing American servicemen for the better part of a decade. The assignment was simple in the way all impossible assignments are described as simple. Insert under a humanitarian cover. Embed with a local aid organization that had been quietly cooperating with American intelligence for years. Identify the courier who moved the weapons, and hand off the intelligence to a strike team that would handle the rest. She was not to engage. She was not to be seen. She was not to exist. She had spent 4 months learning the rhythms of the village, sharing tea with women who taught her how to bake bread in a clay oven, listening to the elders argue about water rights, holding the hands of children whose fathers had disappeared into the mountains. She had grown to love them, in the careful, guarded way her training allowed, and she had also identified the courier within 6 weeks. A quiet man with a limp who ran a small shop near the market and who received deliveries at hours that did not match the schedule of any legitimate supplier. The intelligence had been passed up the chain. The strike had been approved. And then, 3 days before the operation, the convoy she was traveling in, a battered white truck marked with the symbol of the aid organization, had been hit by an improvised explosive device buried in the road, and the world had gone white, then red, then black. She remembered the heat of the fire on her face. She remembered crawling, dragging her left leg behind her, toward the sound of a child crying somewhere beyond the smoke. She remembered pulling the boy out from beneath a piece of twisted metal, pressing her own jacket against the wound on his thigh, telling him in his own language that his mother was coming, that he was brave, that he was safe, even as her own blood pooled in the dirt beside her. She did not remember the helicopter. She did not remember the medics. She only remembered, somewhere in the long gray distance between consciousness and whatever waited on the other side of it, the sound of her father's voice on the porch, telling her to come home. But never to come home easy. The lead medic was a senior chief named Hollis, a man who had been pulling broken bodies out of broken places for 19 years and who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything he found inside a human being. But when he cut away the last of the torn fabric and saw the chest rig, the laminated card, and the small black tattoo on her collarbone, the shape of a compass with no needle, he felt something cold travel down the length of his spine. He had heard rumors about that tattoo. Every operator in the special operations community had heard the rumors, the kind of rumors that were repeated quietly, in the corners of mess halls, by men who had served long enough to know that some units were spoken about only in past tense, even while they were still operating. He looked at his junior medic, a younger man named Reyes, and he saw in Reyes's face the same recognition, the same dawning understanding that the woman bleeding out in the dirt in front of them was not the civilian translator they had been briefed about, and that whatever was happening here was already several layers above their pay grade. Hollis did the only thing a good medic can do in a situation that has suddenly become more complicated than the wound. He kept working. He packed the wound. He ran the line. He called out vitals to Reyes in a voice that did not shake. And he did not ask the question that was burning behind his eyes until she opened them and answered it for him. When she whispered those 4 words, I outrank you. Listen, he did. She told him, in a voice barely louder than the wind, that the strike was compromised, that the courier had been tipped, that there was a second device, larger than the first, set to detonate when the response team arrived at the village to recover her body. She told him a frequency, a code phrase, and a name, and she told him to relay all three up the chain immediately, and to do it without using the standard channels because the leak was internal. Then she closed her eyes and she stopped talking, and Hollis, for the first time in 19 years, found himself running not toward a wounded soldier, but away from one. Sprinting toward the radio with the weight of an entire operation suddenly resting on the accuracy of 4 sentences from a woman he had been told did not exist. The message went up. The strike was held. The second device was located, disarmed, and traced back to a contractor whose name had appeared on 3 previous incident reports that no one had ever connected. 27 men who would have been in that village at sunrise went home to their families instead. None of them ever knew her name. None of them ever knew that the woman who had saved their lives was, at that moment, being loaded onto a medevac helicopter with 2 units of blood already running into her arm, and a senior chief named Hollis holding her hand, as if his grip alone could keep her on the right side of the line between this world and the next. She woke up 4 days later in a hospital bed at Landstuhl, in Germany, with a tube in her throat and a nurse adjusting the drip beside her, and the first thing she did was try to sit up, because that was what her training had taught her to do, to assess, to orient, to move. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and the firm hands of someone who had seen this exact reaction 1,000 times, pressed her gently back against the pillow and told her, in English, that she was safe, that she was among her own people, and that there was a man in the hallway who had refused to leave the floor for 3 days and who would very much like to see her when she was ready. Her father had flown in from Pennsylvania the moment the call had come. The carefully worded call that told him only that his daughter had been injured in the line of duty and that he should come quickly. He walked into the room with the same quiet steadiness she had inherited from him, sat down in the chair beside her bed, took her hand in both of his, and did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, he said only, "You came home," and she, through the tube and the pain and the long fog of the medication, managed to squeeze his hand and let him know that she had heard him. The recovery was slow. The shrapnel had torn through muscle and grazed an artery, and the surgeons had spent 6 hours putting her back together. She would walk with a slight hitch in her stride for the rest of her life, a small price compared to what so many of her brothers and sisters in arms had paid. She spent 8 weeks in physical therapy, learning to trust her left leg again, learning to climb stairs without thinking about it, learning to run, slowly at first, then faster. Until one morning she ran a full mile, without stopping, and stood at the end of the gravel path with tears on her face and the cold German air burning in her lungs. The debrief, when it came, was conducted in a small room by 3 people whose names she was never given. They asked her questions for 2 days. She answered every one of them with the same careful precision she had used to identify the courier, to read the village, to whisper 4 words to a SEAL medic in the dust. When the debrief was over, the senior of the 3 officers stood up, walked around the table, and quietly pinned a small piece of metal to the inside of her hospital gown, where no one would ever see it. He told her that the country could never officially thank her for what she had done. He told her that her name would never appear in any after-action report, in any newspaper, on any wall of honor. And then he told her that 27 men were alive because of her, and that he was one of them, because his son had been on the response team that would have walked into the second device, and that for the rest of his life he would carry the knowledge that a woman he was not allowed to name had given his son back to him. She did not return to the field. The injury, the exposure, and the simple arithmetic of how many years a body can absorb that kind of work made the decision for her, and she made peace with it slowly, the way she had made peace with everything else the work had taken. She was reassigned to a training role at a facility whose location she could not share even with her father, where she taught younger women and men the same hard, quiet skills that had been taught to her, and where she watched a new generation of operators step into the long shadow she had walked in for so many years. She was a different kind of teacher than her own instructors had been. She was harder in some ways and softer in others. She did not tolerate carelessness, did not tolerate ego, did not tolerate the small dishonesties that, in her world, got people killed. But she also sat down with her students after the worst days, in the small mess hall, and she told them stories, carefully edited stories, about a village she had once known, about a boy she had pulled from a burning truck, about a senior chief named Hollis who had held her hand on a helicopter. She taught them that the work was not about being the strongest or the fastest or the most lethal, although they would need to be all of those things. She taught them that the work was about discipline, about the willingness to do the right thing when no one was watching and no one would ever know. She taught them that leadership was not a rank, it was a habit, the daily habit of putting the mission and the people around you above your own comfort. She taught them that perseverance was not the absence of doubt, it was the choice to keep moving while the doubt was still in your chest. She taught them that teamwork was a sacred thing, that the person to your left and the person to your right were the only people in the world who could truly understand what you were carrying, and that you owed them your honesty, your competence, and your life. She taught them, above all, that they were going to be afraid, and that being afraid was not a failure. It was simply the price of caring about something larger than yourself. On the wall of her small office, she kept a single photograph, a faded picture of her father standing on the porch of the house in eastern Pennsylvania, a glass of iced tea in his hand, the river behind him running rust-colored in the late afternoon light. Beneath the picture, in her own handwriting, she had pinned a small index card with the sentence he had given her on the day she signed her name. Be the kind of soldier who comes home, but never the kind who comes home easy. Her students would sometimes ask her what it meant. She would smile, the small, careful smile she had learned to wear in 100 countries under 100 different names, and she would tell them that one day, if they did the work honestly, they would understand it without needing to ask. Elena Marie Vance never wrote a book. She never gave an interview. She never stood on a stage and accepted an award for the things she had done in places that were not on any map, for the lives she had saved with 4 whispered words in the dirt, for the secrets she had carried so carefully that even the men whose lives she had given back to their families would never know the shape of her face. She lived, instead, the long, quiet life of a soldier who had chosen a harder path than glory, the path of the people who serve in the dark so that others can sleep in the light. Her story matters not because it is exceptional, although it is, but because it is one of thousands. There are women like her in every branch of every service in every country that has ever asked its daughters to stand in the breach. Women whose names you will never read, whose faces you will never see, whose sacrifices are measured not in medals, but in the simple fact of strangers coming home alive. If her story has moved you, remember that the next time you pass a quiet woman in an airport, a coffee shop, a parking lot, with a slight hitch in her stride and a careful watchfulness in her eyes, you may be passing a person who has carried more than you will ever know. Thank her if you can. And if you cannot, simply live the kind of life that is worthy of what she gave. Be the kind of person who comes home, but never the kind who comes home easy. That was her father's lesson, and it became hers, and now, if you will let it, it can become yours. Tell me in the comments, whose story does this remind you of, and who in your life has carried a silence you only now understand?